Yes.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Roger Lancaster, Cultural Studies at GMU.
and GMU in this case might sound like it's sort of a bargain TV
It is.
sales channel,
It is.
but
We've been living in the bubble for the past 40 years, and it's eventually going to break. Now, George Mason University,
is another way of understanding it. Now,
known to many people as Koch brothers University, because it represents about 90% of where they've put their money, but they don't spread it around. It all goes into econ and the law school. So
they've
most
got
of us don't see any of this bounty.
there are some true believers in the idea of the market as the way of understanding all subjectivity, all experience, and all of worthy life. Those neoclassical economists, they're so imperialistic, Roger, aren't they?
Well, I mean, we have honestly, we sometimes have interesting conversations with them because
Okay.
because unlike a lot of what happens in the humanities and even in the interpretive social sciences, they have a theory, they have a model. It's semi-rigorous at least some of the time, and they know how to argue it. So you can oddly enough, the Marxists among us sometimes have interesting
No, I
exchanges
can
with
believe that. But what happens when they meet people like you who actually go into the world and meet people and learn
them.
about how they conduct themselves?
Well, that's another question. That's a question that could be posed to a lot of, a lot of armchair sociologists and so on, right? I mean, there's all of that.
Of course, and to cultural studies for that matter. There's a lot of, no, today I'm wearing Told You So with a vision of Carlito.
There you go.
But yesterday I was reading Emil Durkheim, and he was pretty good on the old armchair ethnography, I think.
He had sources and he reflected on them very intelligently, right? There's no way around that.
Oh no, no.
Um,
And despite the monumental misuse of people like Weber and Durkheim and Zimmel by Parsons, they were all socialists, you know.
Yes. In fact, I used to nurture this strange idea, which was something like, the socialist origins of the social sciences, which would be like, let's look at where the idea of sociology came from and who nurtured it and how the ideas, I mean, very different kinds of socialism, clearly, right? So, like Durkheim socialism was an alternative to the Marxist socialism of the day, right? But no, I mean, they were often very much concerned with some kind of socialist idea. I've never pursued that. Someone should. Any listeners out there?
Could be you. And
Could
Prof,
be me. I don't know what I do next. So there.
well, I like to ask all my guests, as you know, what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you? What's going on for the prof?
Well, we were kind of getting at it a moment ago, right? Like for me, what's dynamizing and what gets me excited is the return of socialism as an idea, as a movement, as a goal, as something that energizes substantial numbers of people. And I feel like I've been waiting for it for like 40 years now, right? And it's final. It's been a, it's been a gradually increasing thing since, I don't know, supposedly post-Occupy, right? But it's gone through a number of waves, crests, declines, but it doesn't decline all the way back to ground zero. It comes back again stronger. So, we were all very excited by Bernie's campaign in 2016. Now, I know the purists out there will cluck their tongues and say, oh, he's not even a real socialist. He's just a liberal social democrat or something. But perhaps there's some truth to that, but perhaps he put out there an idea of socialism, and it excited a lot of people. And more recently, we've seen the Mamdani mania that has swept not just New York, but like all the coastal cities in a way, right? So increasingly, there's a nucleus, a growing nucleus of people who are interested in socialism.
No, I'm loving the fact, Roger, that the New York Times every day gives space to its usual retinue of right-wing Democrats saying, we are not socialists, we are capitalists. They're on the run, these guys.
And the more they say it, the more they build up our momentum on the other side, I think, right? Because I think large numbers of people are just tired of the same old shit. They're exhausted with moderate mainstream Democrats who have delivered really very little. I mean, in some ways, Obama came in on a wave of hope and optimism and set forth very substantially deflating it and undoing it. And the result was Trump. I mean, Trump is literally the result of Obama, and Obama is probably the best of the mainstream Democrats, an intelligent, savvy, non-overreactive figure who would preside over decline, basically. And that's what they have to offer, right? If you want something other than to preside over decline, you're probably moving your affiliation over in the direction of DSA or some other socialist formation.
Now, Roger, this has brought to mind an old-fashioned expression that I don't think is used much anymore, which is actually existing socialism. If we go back in your work, written quite a bit about, in a sense, actually existing socialism, and I'm thinking here in particular of Nicaragua,
right?
Which you wrote about in the 80s, before the end of the Cold War, and you also wrote about I guess, towards the turn of the century. And that book's just been translated recently into Spanish. I have to say that I was able to download this. I hope I wasn't being a pirate. This is in the latest version, which has a wonderful prologue by you to your Spanish readers.
Right. Thank you for reading that, actually. Yes, it hasn't been read in English.
No, probably not. Yeah. And this is the story. I mean, your first work on Nicaragua is not so focused on questions of intimacy and power. The second work of the new one, now in Spanish, is. But for many of us in the 80s, Sandinismo was an extraordinary inspiration. And for many of us nowadays, it's more a matter of shame and embarrassment. Now, are those polarities still operating, or where do you take your stand now, as it were?
Well, I'm not sure I take a stand. I mean, I feel like I'm an observer at this point, right? I'm an aging observer at this point because Thanks to God and the Revolution came out. It was my doctoral thesis written in 86, 87. It comes out in 88. So we're dating me, right? I'm a dinosaur at this point. So yes, the Soviet Union still existed. Uh, China was still semi-Maoist in many regards, right? The US was still licking its wounds from being severely beaten in Vietnam by a revolutionary people's movement. And the scene just looked so different and at that point, right? So I kind of wagered, like I think many of us did. I I ended up in a sort of a third worldist camp. My understanding at the time was that if there are going to be any advances toward socialism or something like socialism, it's going to happen in places like Nicaragua. It's going to happen in Central America. It's going to happen in the global South. It's often going to be a post-dictatorship phenomenon because dictatorships give rise to certain kinds of very big movements. Of course, every book since then was kind of socialism didn't disappear in all the books that come out since then, right? It's just that I bracket it off. It's sort of like I end up saying somewhere in the book, and you see, you have all of these kinds of phenomena happening in no small part because there's no socialism or there's no socialist movement or because we lack this. But it'll come back, I often say, right? And of course, it's coming back is naturally part of what excites me. Where do I stand on this now, right? I mean, Nicaragua was a truly modern revolution that seemed to have absorbed many of the lessons that you would hope revolutionaries had absorbed, right? So it was, in some sense, liberal. It didn't conduct re-education seminars all the time, right? It didn't. It was a little bit censorious from time to time with the media, but no all-out shutdown of opposition. It was democratic. It held real elections, and it's in a very Catholic religious country. Its approach to religion was largely accepting, if not, if not more than that. And of course, you had the liberation Catholics who were around in substantial numbers then. So, I stand by everything I ever wrote about Nicaragua. It was exciting to be part of that. I was on the ground there. I was doing field work, interviewing people. The return of something called Sandinismo with Daniel Ortega and his wife with Murillo. Yes, well, you said embarrassing. I think it's increasingly problematic, and I have arguments about this with some of my friends who don't want to acknowledge quite how bad it's become. But I think Daniel Ortega has either put in prison or sent into exile and stripped of citizenship almost every prominent Sandinista from the 1980s, including his own brother, who died under house arrest for a very mild criticism of his brother in power. So yeah. It's almost as though Ortega learned the lesson that you better not have real democracy, and that's the lesson that he learned was you can't do that, right? And thereby, I hate talking about this, as you can see, right? Because I think everybody has their revolution betrayed narrative ready. And this has been one of the things that happens in almost any social movement. You see, they betrayed the revolution, or they were really con men all along, and you just meet the new boss, same as we have all these narratives. but I don't think they tell you much. I think all right, in some way you could step 1,000 feet back and say that kind of describes it. But whatever happened in any of these situations is always very specific, and it always happens in a certain sort of way. And I mean, I haven't done research in Nicaragua since the early 90s, so I'm looking at it from afar. Someone up close could probably give you a better accounting of exactly how it is that Ortega got a stranglehold on the party first, marginalized everyone else in the party second. It doesn't quite explain how it is that the dissidents failed to do very well in any elections. I mean, they formed a Sandinista regeneration party, but it never got more than 1% of the vote. So the masses stuck with the known quantity Sandinismo under FSLN, and the Ortega and his wife captured that completely.
A point taken. It's a tender issue, and as you say, one that you haven't been close to for some time. But one of the things that changed somewhat in between your first book about Nicaragua and your second one, the one that's just come out, as I said, in Spanish, is to talk about machismo, masculinity,
Right.
Sex, and so on. And you've done the same with a book about Mexico, with the fantastic title, The Struggle to Be Gay in Mexico, for example. And I've not got access to these books, but I have read some of your essays about sex in Latin America. And I very much like the quasi-imaginary dialogue that you provide of a conversation in which one is being told that Latin America is repressive towards gay people, queer people, and so on, with the implicit price deflator being that in the US of A, things are just a heck of a lot better. I'm sure you've listened, you've heard these things.
Compared with what? Compared with
Yes.
West Virginia or Texas or whatever.
Even so. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that angle of research, which has been not the only thing you looked at, but very important in much of your work over the last 2 or 3 decades.
I'll try. I mean, there are several ideas that orient me. And of course, one of them is ethnography and ethnographic writing. Whatever else I do, I think at my best, I'm an ethnographer. And when I've done projects that weren't ethnographic, they didn't somehow come out quite as well. So that's one thing, right? I'm a practitioner of this strange craft that is kind of hard to explain to people, but they get it if they see it and encounter it, right? Another one is something like queer theory. There's a long thread. I hesitate to say queer anymore. Forever, it's become just as depleted a term as gay was. It was supposed to replace a depleted term, but it's like, no shit, man. Really? When you encounter the word queer in the New York Times or NPR, it's been depleted. You've worn it out. But I tried to understand gender and sexuality and how they come together and how they reinforce each other and how they are experienced in real life, densely written settings. So in Life is Hard, there's that chapter that was one of the more influential things I've written. it undergirded HIV prevention efforts for the better part of a decade because, oh my God, wait, what? We discover something. Not everyone who has sex with men identifies as gay, right? So like this opens up a whole channel for prevention efforts. And if you look at the footnotes on any of those social health articles about men who have sex with men, you'll find that it takes you back to that chapter in Life is Hard, Subject Honor, Object Shame, which is a look at the way same-sex relationships, not everywhere, but in large parts of Latin America in certain class settings, especially in lower class settings and indigenous and so on, right? How social convention understands male activity and sexual quote unquote passivity and all of that. So yeah, I that was a novel idea at the moment that ideas about homosexuality might have something to do with their ideas about masculinity. Wait. Now it seems cliche, right? I mean, I don't think anyone would bat an eye, but in 1992, it was a kind of a novelish, not completely novel, but certainly ish concept. And as you note, right, I mean, this strand has kind of continued up to the present and other things that I've worked on, right? So the new book, by the way, is coming out in Spanish probably later this year. It's been translated. They've got a mocked up cover. It's ready to go. So
fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
And there's a big difference between doing ethnography in a complex but relatively small place like Nicaragua versus doing ethnography in a monumentally large and also complex place like Mexico. So given that you're saying that's where you're in a sense most comfortable with your work, queer ethnography, could you talk about the scale of doing research in places that are so distinct, just in terms of their size?
Well, this is a real challenge for ethnographic work today, right? And this is like, I know everyone wants to be doing some form of digital ethnography these days. And I think it's very hard to do. But as you say, right, ethnographic methods were devised for small scale societies, face-to-face settings, something easily done in a community and in a defined community. How do you do it when those conditions don't obtain in a big urban setting? I mean, most of my work in Mexico was in Puebla de Los Angeles, but Puebla is, of course, a big city. And not only is Puebla a big city, but it's connected in many ways with other places like Mexico City, another really big place, and Oaxaca to the south, and so on and so on. I don't have an easy answer to that. I mean, this is probably why it took me. Usually, I used to do a book every 5 years, and every 5 years was a restart, and I'd start a new project and I'd re-educate myself and do blah, blah, blah. But there was more like a 12-year period in between Sex Panic and the Punitive State and the struggle to be gay. And part of it was the difficulty in doing a credible and dense and deep ethnographic work in a very complex and changing setting. I used all the tricks. I used all the writer's tricks at my disposal to do this, right? I'll tell you a story though. I'll tell you why I thought it was so difficult. I had faculty leave one year. It was 2017. And I had the idea of sitting down and writing this book. And I sat down and I started writing. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I looked at it. I was like, I start out in September or something. And by March, I'm feeling pretty pleased with myself because I've got, a couple of 100 pages now. And I think they're good. And then I took a second or third look at them and I thought, oh my God, like this isn't an ethnography at all. It's a set of field notes. I've never been so embarrassed, like I embarrassed in front of myself, I suppose. But you can see what happened was in part that I hadn't gone through the work earlier of compiling field notes, which is probably to say I got lazy in my practice or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first step towards getting this book in hand was to actually set things out in the form of field notes. Now I used most of them, right? This is the interesting thing. I said, fuck, I am so upset. I'm going to leave it I'm not even going to look at this for 6 months. When I came back 6 months later, I started pulling the pieces together into chapters and settings. And I continued fiddling with them for 2 or 3 years, but I ended up using a lot of writer's tricks to bring them together. So there's a long chapter called Postcards from the Ambiente, and it diverges from the other chapter structure. I'm stealing from acknowledged stealing from Carlos Monsiváis' technique of postcards, but like so. Instead of giving you a regular chapter narrative about what Mexicans call the ambiente and its relationship to the gay subculture, I do it in little snippets. I do it in postcards. I think it worked. A lot of people seem to like that chapter. Everyone looks at it and says, oh, it's an experimental technique. Well, I don't know if it is kind of experimental, but it was the only way I could get this in hand, it appeared, and I did. The other chapter on the history of identity formations in Mexico, I stage as a 3-act play. Yeah, I know. See, I told you I use writer's tricks to make some of the pieces work.
And that sounds very exciting. It does sound quite experimental in the sense that it is crossing genres.
Yeah.
One of the things about ethnography, a bit like archival research, is that there are times when it produces real surprise. When you find something, you read something, you learn, you hear something that is a shock. Were there things that surprised you in the field?
Almost everything. I mean, look, I almost always come away surprised. Like I go into a project thinking I'm going to find one thing, and of course you don't quite find that, or you find something else. So I give you a clearer example would be The Trouble with Nature. I mean, I went into that project thinking that maybe they had found evidence for a gay gene.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe those origin stories, fables that everyone was telling about how foraging life over prehistoric millennia had shaped human nature. Maybe that was true, right? so I went in being very open to some of those ideas. But the more I dug around in them, this was not the ethnographic work. The more I dug around in them, the more it appeared to me otherwise, right? The more it appeared to me there's no real science here. There's no real findings here. These are soothing stories that people are telling. And in the ethnographic work, I think it's more like cascading surprises. I mean, in Mexico, things have become increasingly tolerant and increasingly open. And if you're planted in 2006, I still remember in 2006, my informants were telling me Mexico will never have a female president. That's impossible. It could never happen here. Or you know, the Mexicans will never support gay marriage. All right, all right. Just a few years later, you've got, you know, by 2011, you have gay marriage in Mexico starting to gather steam, right? It starts as marriage in Mexico City, but then there are a series of court cases. The courts rule that marriages performed in Mexico City have to be recognized everywhere. Duh. And then it just sort of cascades from there. I took advantage of Puebla's being under a judicial injunction order in oh God, this is horrible. What year was it when I got married? I think 2019. So Puebla was under a court order to perform same-sex marriages. Everything about this is surprising if you think about. I mean, if you have too overcooked a view of what machismo is and how Mexican culture works and what it means to be religious and somewhat conservative, right? All of this should come as something of a surprise, right? And it does.
That was really my next question. Whether, as it were, machismo.
What about machismo? What do we want to know?
Well, is it withering?
Is it withering?
Or if not, where is it going? Because for many people, it is an absolute staple for understanding Mexican society.
It is, and I apologize for that. I mean, I feel like I owe your listeners an apology for it, right? I mean, I think I'm being cheeky, but I'm also being serious. I probably put that word machismo into certainly wider academic circulation starting in about 1988 with the essay that eventually becomes a chapter in Life is Hard in 1992. And it has a certain picture of manhood, right? I mean, it's sort of exaggerated masculinity, penetrative, defined by being aggressive and penetrative. And if you stay too close to that, and if you have this as your daguerreotype for what Mexican or Nicaraguan or Latin American culture looks like, all right, you'll capture some things with it, but you'll miss a lot of the nuance. You'll miss a lot of other things. And there were of course criticisms of that concept even back in the 90s. Is machismo a durable thing, or is it something cooked up in the Mexican cinema of the 1940s and 50s, right? Like there's an argument that this is a product of a certain kind of cinematic moment, right? Um, uh, when men are being macho or machista, is that all that they're being? Um, I think my friend and colleague Matt Gutman has made a big fuss over, Mexican men supposedly machistas, but yet they were always holding the baby. They were always carrying the baby. They're always like, also being very caring paternal figures at the same time. And I think that's something I didn't see much in Nicaragua when I concocted these ideas, right? But you put an idea out there in part so that it can be modified and morphed and changed over time. So there's an interesting set of reflections. There's a small set in The Struggle to Be Gay. It's during COVID lockdown, and my husband and I start playing basketball on one of the open air courts. We go out to shoot hoops, and the gyms are all closed. You can't get your exercise, right? So within very shortly, we're joined by two brothers who were studying at a university. We show up every night. We make little teams. We play. A few days later, we're joined by a couple of homeless guys who play with us. Then within a week, kids from the neighborhood are showing up and play. Long story short, within a few weeks, there's a nucleus of about, I don't know how many, 30 to 50, mostly working class people. A lot of them are students, but they have working class origins, who are gathering to play basketball on this court. And it's an interesting social space. Okay, it's younger than average. So here, is Mexico still machista? The kids didn't care. Well, all right, they might tease the gay players, and it might even seem like mean, taunting teasing, but it wasn't anything that would socially isolate the gay players. The trans boy who would come and play was well treated by everyone. I don't. Once in a while, people would get a little wigged out, like, Roger, I'm not gay, and it's like, I didn't say you were. Why? Don't be so defensive, right? But in other words, it seems to me that in Mexico, a lot of things are probably a lot like they are in the United States or other countries, which is to say, if you're 35 or under, things have changed a great deal.
No, absolutely. I mean, think about public opinion about gay marriage in the United States and how rapidly that changed, in part because of campaigns that pointed out it's your son, it's your daughter, it's your friend, it's your teacher. Gay people are in your life. And
yeah.
they're everywhere. They are everywhere, right?
So here was this little basketball court, 30 to 50 people, and it had a mix of lesbian, gay, straight, mostly straight, but there was a mixed scene, and everyone there got along, right? I mean, everyone there was okay with it. And that's an interesting change, because I don't think one of my earliest memories of Mexico was watching kids taunting an old queen. How's that? Like, it was on the streets of Cuernavaca, And these kids were really harassing
Right.
this old queen in a way that, yeah. So,
Well, I've got a
um,
story for you too, Roger, if I could. This is from
yes, please.
25 years ago. I spent a summer living in Mexico City, and these were the days when you had to walk to a cyber cafe to get online, which
But of course,
I did every afternoon.
of
And
course.
I managed, without meaning to do this, to time this for when children were coming out of school and waiting for the bus.
Right.
And every day, these young boys, 13, 14, would shout out, pinche gringo maricón, right? Which which for people who don't speak Spanish, more or less
Yes.
is, fucking gay gringo, right? But
Right.
nastier, nastier. And I didn't
Were
like
they
it.
talking about you?
Yeah. I guess,
Oh, they were harassing you. Yes.
yeah, I
Okay.
guess because of
I
it,
believe this.
and
I
because of
believe this sometimes.
earrings, earrings, therefore gay,
Right. Right.
white and tall, therefore, comparative to Mexican and therefore American, right? So
Right.
anyway, one of my last nights in town, I went to a party organized by some feminists and I said, help me out. I keep wanting to say to these people, I'm not gay, I'm not an American, but there's nothing wrong necessarily with being an American or being gay.
Not that there's
But
anything wrong with
this is
that.
this is not how you respond to 13-year-old boys in a bus stop.
Right.
What should I say? They said, simple. This was a group of very, in inverted commas, hardcore feminists. No me chingues way, which basically means don't fuck
Yes.
me, asshole, people. So I
Right.
thought, God, they might kill me if I do that. But the next day I did, and they stood up and applauded. And every day from that point on until I left, they would wave at me and say hello and all the rest of it. And this was, I mean, you laugh, and it is funny. And this was
It
also
is
a
funny.
lesson about categories, because the other thing, which I'm sure you've also seen and maybe experienced, Roger, is that in the United States, if you identify somebody racially, that can be a tinderbox.
Right.
Now, it can be here too, but it can also be a sign of belonging. So
Right.
I know when I'm living in different parts of Mexico, at different points in my life, when people start calling me güero, which is white guy, it means I've arrived.
Right.
I'm recognized. I'm seen. This is something that would not work well,
Right.
in,
Right.
let's say, many other contexts. So just a couple of little stories about me to share. Yeah.
No, I like you. I like your story very much because in part it shows it first seems to be showing this overwhelming wall of hatred,
Yeah.
but then it shows just how easy it was to puncture that and to become, oh, okay, all right.
Well, and because
He knows how to shit talk,
I
and that's
had
okay.
exactly, I had trash talk at my disposal because I had people who grew up there and knew this kind of talk and knew that it
Right.
didn't necessarily presage violence.
Right.
It needed
Right.
a certain kind of reaction. And
Right.
I was able
Exactly.
to parrot the
But
reaction.
this is also part, this is, I try to write about, all right. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize. I try to write about Mexican humor.
Mm.
Mexican humor is often self-deprecating. It's often incredibly cruel. And it invites, like as in your case there, it invites a certain kind of retort that will put the other person off guard and oh you know how to play this game and there right. I mean I have a great deal of fun with the word puto,
Mm.
meaning fag or queer or like a disparaging term for male homosexual. And I have a whole chapter on the use of this word and what it means and what it can mean and how it goes into play in a variety of ways. And I end on a set of vignettes where, in Mexico, eh, given the way this is structured, everyone is puto under certain circumstances, right? And Mexicans would tell you this. I'm not telling you anything, that a person on the street wouldn't tell you, right? Um, so yeah, this is No, I love that story. It's much better than the one about the old queen. See, the old queen who was being taunted, this was 1983 or 84, because I was studying language in Cuernavaca, right? The old queen turned around and cursed the boys.
Mm.
And he cursed them in the old-fashioned sense, like, I curse you. This like, you make fun of me. This is those kids. Oh my God, I've never seen. They froze. They were paralyzed. They were terrified. Like, he's hurled around and put a curse on them, essentially. And now they don't know what to do. And it wasn't anything like the funny moment that you recount, where they internalize it, take it on, and roll with it, right? It was much sadder, really. Um, but yeah, there's a different turnaround, I suppose.
Ralph, I've got one more question for you. And once you've answered it, I also want to give you then the opportunity to add anything you wish. And additions might take the form of going over terrain we've already covered, whether something more you want to say, or might be entirely new as a topic. Does that sound okay as a means of
Sure.
to a close?
Yeah.
So the last question is a sort of double-barreled one, bringing together two things of yours I've read. One is about vengeance and the idea of justice and how there's a problem with revenge and justice. Right. And the other is about growing up with guns. There's a terrific...
Growing up in what?
With guns.
Oh, yes. Oh, you found that obscure piece. Okay.
Yes. Now, I may have read these things more recently than you have.
You have, I think.
Case. But could you tell us a little bit about vengeance as a problem, I think, that you identify, and also talk a little bit about growing up with guns, because you try to make this more legible to urban people who are frightened of guns than is often the case.
So look, I could start with the guns one, right? So I wrote a very simple piece for the anthropology journal, anthropology newsletter, I think, and it's about guns, and I'm trying to have like the space where I grew up in a rural area in North Carolina. Guns were part of my childhood. Everybody had one. Everybody hunted, and it was. I think I understand it well enough. I also think I understand why people who live in cities are terrified of them and don't want them anywhere around. And I, living in a city as a gay man, like, I think I get that too, right? But there, I wanted to kind of bridge a conversation here. It seems to me it would be a useful conversation to try to have. You're not going to, if you're a Democrat or a socialist running for office in a place like Vermont, you're probably not going to win if you're anti-gun. Mm-hmm. If your version of gun control is a total ban on guns, Bernie is not going to win in Vermont, right? And you can multiply that example, across the map. So maybe we could have a different sort of dialogue. Maybe we could start with things that are easier to, like, everybody I know in North Carolina thinks there ought to be some gun restrictions, right? You could probably convince them that, safe storage ought to be a requirement, and it ought to be enforced in some way or other, right? You could probably convince them that there ought to be a cooling off period. You shouldn't be able to buy a gun in a hurry, right? Like, give it cool it a little bit, right? Don't buy a gun mad. Hit a pause button there, right? So I think. I think if you could have an honest, real conversation across the rural and urban divides here, you could probably make some traction towards some kind of sound policy. But you have to overcome a lot of distrust on both sides to get there.
Mm.
And that it's without it's it was in this vein that I wrote the piece because I knew what my anthropology colleagues were going. I mean, they study primitive people, rustics. They study all kinds of phenomena that have a lot to do with guns, actually, a lot of the time, but somehow they don't take this with them to their understanding of how it might work in the United States, right? So let's try to do that. I'm surprised you found the piece. I don't think most people have seen it. I don't like this is just sort of fell through a black hole of disappeared stuff or something. But I also did I did some very careful statistical work in that piece, right? So, um, yeah.
Well, I think it's helpful, and it's a challenge to absolutists like myself.
Well, good. I mean, I don't, and we can have this conversation in more depth, and I could prepare for it a little better than what I have. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's probably true. Well, it's almost certainly true that the more guns you have in circulation, the more deaths you're going to have from gun violence. A lot of that is suicides. Really, actually, a lot of that is suicide.
Yes.
But there's something, guns tend to make suicide attempts very absolute and irreversible. So it's true that like the more guns you have, the more gun violence you're going to have, and there's that. But of course, in America, in the United States of America, the levels of gun violence don't follow the expected trend line. The gun violence is like much higher than what you would expect if you compared it with other gun-owning countries like Canada or let's see, Canada, Norway, Switzerland. I think these are all fairly high gun ownership countries. So whatever's driving American violence isn't just guns.
For sure. And you can probably
as an Englishman, there's an interesting stat. There are more homicides by knife in New York than there are homicides by all methods in London. Right? I mean, yikes. Anyway.
It is a yikes. On the score of vengeance, revenge, justice, I wondered if you could say a few words.
So I think what you found was this contribution to a volume, probably on oh God, what was it on? I don't even remember. Was it ethics? It was Didier Fassan's collection on but my contribution sort of comes out of the stuff I was doing on punishment in Sex Panic and the Punitive State. So this was kind of a segue out, related thing that came out of that. So what, I mean, I ended up delving a little bit into the classic Platonic notion as a starting point, which, Plato distinguishes between punishment as vengeance and punishment as correction. And there's way back at the beginning of Western civilization, you have this founding idea that punishment as vengeance is normatively undesirable. It doesn't do much to make the person better. It has certain theatrical and performative elements, but it doesn't. It's the wrong reason. It's the wrong approach. And Plato ends up with what punishment that looks forward to the future will try to correct the person, and society will see that he's being corrected so that they will desist from their law-breaking ways. There's funny language for talking about it, right? But I mean, these ideas echo across European and American history over subsequent centuries. How did I get into this conversation, right? I mean, it's an offshoot from something else.
No, sure. And I think it's a useful topic because it gets to so much about what is the core of the social order,
right?
What is the basis of everyday life, and what
Right.
allows for a sense of security for people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine a society without vengeance, I suppose. One can't, well, it's hard to imagine a society without punishment, right? For reasons that Durkheim gives you, which is to say, the difference between a recommendation and a rule is that the rule entails a punishment if you break it, right? So that's otherwise all of social life would be a series of recommendations.
Yeah.
So that's I think I had also stumbled into this in part because of some arguments that I was having with the prison abolitionists at the moment, which is to say, I wrote a long piece in Jacobin that basically argued, I mean, it shows how bad the US carceral system is, how cruel and bloated and awful it is. I'm very clear about that. But then it says that our model ought to be something more like Norway or Sweden or even Finland, and not the idea of abolishing prisons altogether. In other words, we should have a humane, welfarist, radically shrunk down prison. You should go, if you commit a violent offense, you should go to prison as your punishment. You don't go to prison to be punished. If you hear my difference there, right? Like it should be a humane setting. It should have education. It should have social services, medical care, et cetera, at high levels and so on. So yes, if it's hard to imagine a society without some kind of punishment, one of the things that you ought to do is to think out how punishment can be tolerated, how it can be human and humanizing rather than dehumanizing. Now, lots of ways of that whole thing going astray.
No, sure. And I should say to folks, I've not read this Jacobin piece because I think Jacobin has the proverbial paywall. So
right.
It isn't quite as socialist as it might be.
This one is in the web. You can find it if you look for it.
Yeah, my research didn't get me there.
Yeah.
Finally, anything you'd like to add, Roger?
What would I like to add? I don't know. We've been through a lot. We've been through a lot of different pieces
Hmm.
of work. I mean, this is the sad story of my intellectual career. I haven't stuck with one thing and just bored deeper and deeper and deeper into that one thing, right? Instead, I've kind of had a journey where, all right, my first book was on liberation theology, and my second book was kind of like family studies but inflected by cultural studies methods, right? And then the next project, it was a collection. And then after that, it was critical science studies. Uh, and then after that, it was sex panics, um, which continue. This is interesting. The book was written in 2011, published 2011. Um, I think it's still as relevant now as it was then. Um, and I end up back in Latin America, working in Mexico. There are themes that go through these, like gender sexuality is a thread.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm always trying to think about how, you know, racial hierarchies, sexual mores, and class predicaments work out in a volatile and changing world. Um, what more to add? I don't know.
Well, I think that ties together nicely many of your concerns over the years, really well. So thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, Toby. It's been a pleasure. Hope this is coherent when it all comes out.
I think it'll be great.